this is a homecoming for me. When I came here, many of the people who are affiliated with the Center for Civil Society said, "Welcome home." Really felt nice. Felt nice. But then when I go to Guatemala, it's the same. When I go back to Bali, it's the same. So I have many homes, but this one, yeah. So I've been coming since 2002, against my better judgment, because I thought India, I can go anywhere. It's like peanuts. I couldn't stop. I kept coming back. So here, I'm like a bad rash. I just keep turning up. And Parth usually finds something for me to do, including this. So thank you for being part of this, because without you, I wouldn't be here. I would be back in Guatemala. So you obviously were chosen because you're outstanding. Now, so Braun talked about philosophy, politics, and thinking. Well, I'm not good at that, but what was missing, if you go to, say, LSE or something, they have graduate programs or undergraduate programs on philosophy, politics, and economics. So I'm not good at thinking, Barun is, so I'll do something about economics, although Tom, of course, talked about economics and Mohit last night. But I'm going to give you maybe a little bit more of a background in economics from my perspective. So, and the vehicle for that is this thing that we call economic bubbles, which you may know about. If you don't, I'll explain it in a moment. But what we find is that governments construct or contrive a lot of artificial growth, this sort of impressions of economic growth, and then afterwards it all collapses into some ruin or recession. And what happens is that it's seen as a failure of the market, that this economic, no, but in fact, what we can, if we can find it, the antecedents for that collapse are not within the internal structure of markets, it must be something else that we need to look at. And that's what I'm going to tell you. So in a way, I'm going to talk about politics indirectly. So thinking like an economist doesn't mean that you have to be an economist. But I believe, obviously for my training and so on, I think to really be doing what Barun was talking about, you really have to have some grasp of what economists call economics. The failure of Karl Marx had nothing to do with his intellectual stature. He was a genius. But he was just misguided and really, I believe, fundamentally misunderstood not just economics, but human nature. And really, economics is about human action, human behavior. So you gotta start there. So Marx tried to have this intellectual construct that was built in the air, and then he talked about human beings. Well, my construct is human beings, and then what happens? So this is where I think the Marxian project failed, because it's built on air. And I believe that my project it's got something real underneath. It's you. It's about you. It's how you behave. So this is what we're going to do. And then I'm going to talk about these variations in economic activity. And then explain to you what an asset price bubble is. And then what caused them. We see these variations. I mean, you've experienced them in your lifetime. You've seen things happen. What causes them? And if we know that, then we know something about the remedy, or if not the remedy, how to avoid it. Or if not to avoid it, how to mitigate it, so to soften the impact. So I think clear, not just economic thinking, but clear thinking begins with scarcity. I don't know, the Hindi term for this is diverse, but I tried to come up with something. Dearth, scarcity. Scarcity is a foundational principle. Karl Marx did not begin with that. Karl Marx began with what? Production relations. And so then he said, well, there's poverty, and there's private property, and private ownership of capital. one causes the other, get rid of private ownership, and solve the problem of human misery. Well, he never asks, why is there private property? Does private property have any is there any sort of fundamental linkage between being human and owning a cell phone? That's private property. Well, not anymore. I've solved human misery. Well, you really have to have a foundational principle if you're going to, tell people what a good life is, how to live well, how a good community interacts with one another. So scarcity, which I said, how many's taken economics? Or maybe how many have never taken economics? I thought it would be more like that. So people, we're smart. I mean, economists try to explain to the rector that you need an economics and you need to make everybody take it so we have jobs. So we understand that part of it. Now, essentially, it's that we want more than we can have. Now, you say, well, I don't. Well, there's very few people, now, except for some, naked holy man smoking ganja walking the streets of India. Most people want more than what they have. There's a few people that are content being holy, or I've never seen naked women do it. But anyway, it's only naked guys. But most of us want more than what we have. You want a bit more of the whatever we had, paratha. You want another paratha, whatever it may be. So, we're going to assume here that in general, if you can generalize, that humans tend to want more than can be made available for all of us at the same time. Now, that has some very interesting and somewhat problematic implications, which we'll talk about. So, we have unlimited wants and limited means. Whew. Now, India has made amazing progress since I came here the first time. And how do I know that? Pet shops. You have pet shops. If you're rich enough to have a pet shop, instead of fattening up the pet to eat it, you're having a pet shop to please the pet. So this is kind of a universal. The fact that there are pet shops, Green Market has pet shops, at least 2. Now that's impressive. So now, how did we get here? How did we get to the point when I came to India, there was nothing like Green Park Market was different than it is now, dramatically different. Now we have these things. So at that time, the means to get things that people wanted was much more limited than it is now. Kumar reminded me, he said, I had told him years ago, I said the quality of clothing had changed dramatically in India. And that was quite evident to me over the time I came. Now, so we can't have everything we want because everybody else wants much of the same things that we want. And often at the same time. It's going to be interesting. So this is an inescapable fact of life. The Ambanis, whoever, Elon Musk's, they all. Now, the most obvious aspect of scarcity is mortality. We don't live forever. Well, I'm planning to, but it's up to you. You can do what you want, but I'm breaking precedents. But most people have to face that. I never have. Now, the interesting thing about mortality is that instead of coming to this event today, if you live forever, you say, well, I'll wait 1,000 years. It'll still be there. And I'll do it. No, it gives you an urgency. It gives you an impetus to choose. How do I have a fulfilling life? What do I do? What do I come? So I come to an event like this to learn something, to advance my career, to have a better life, because I don't live forever. Otherwise, you'd be, just wait. In fact, you would you wouldn't have to choose because it would just, maybe eventually happen. Mortality is really I think the most vivid example of what the implications of scarcity are. Of course, everything else is like that. Resources, whether it's oil or coal or lithium or whatever it may be, these things are available to us in a limited way, in the same way that time is. But I think time is really the most vivid example of this problem of mortality, and everybody faces it. So even though Elon Musk, the Ambanis have billions, they still have to make choices about how to spend their day, spend their time, spend their money. If they have a wife, it's easier maybe, or a husband. Anyway, now, so what happens is if I'm using something, you won't be able to use it unless we find a way to resolve that problem. And you could beat me up, or we could find a more peaceful way, and this is what we will discuss today. So, again, this is what we begin to think about to become an economist, because I don't think you can, John Maynard Keynes, he's famous for being an economist. I think he took one class in economics, and I think he never understood scarcity. Brilliant guy. Okay? Intelligence got nothing to do with your capacity to understand humanity as it is. Because I'm not very smart. These really smart people, they have these intellectual constructs. I'm not that smart. I don't know how to construct this elaborate. Marx's philosophical framework is very complicated, very complex, very interesting. I had one advantage against my Marxist friends. I read what they read, and they never read what I read. So it was easy to disarm them. So anyway, this is something that we, so if you're using one of the resources, that's another way of saying the same thing. Nobody else can have it unless there's a way to resolve that problem. So what we have then is that scarcity by nature creates conflict. You want it, I have it. You have it, I want it. So conflict is part of being alive. In the sense, now that conflict doesn't need to be, it's not a negative necessarily. Now, so how do we resolve that conflict? Well, there's two general ways. One, violence, slavery, and theft. Doesn't sound, well, it depends. You're a big guy, maybe violence is appealing to him. He can overpower me. Slavery, I don't have to pay you. No, but, when we start thinking about how it influences other people's lives, it doesn't sound like a good place to be. So, as we found in the past, it led to instability and misery for most people. And this was the character of life throughout much of human history. And it was kind of, it's just what happens, It's like, well, I'm born, I'm a slave, So there wasn't a lot of intellectualization about these conditions. Until, again, people began to say, well, maybe there's another solution. So the other way is peaceful cooperation instead of violence. Individual freedom instead of slavery. Voluntary trade instead of theft. Well, that sounds a little bit more appealing. And what we see is that in those civilizations or those countries that embraced that idea, they tended to be more prosperous. Humans flourished, not only materially, but spiritually. They had time for leisure, which one of the points that Mohit talked about yesterday. And out of leisure, look at all the wonderful things that developed. So this is what we're going to have at the back of our mind in our discussions, is that, and what we will see, or what I will suggest to you, political governance depends more on things that look like the former, and market interaction looks more like the latter. So politics or political governance involves granting to a sovereign a monopoly over the legal use of violence. So we say, okay, I'm afraid that he'll use it against me, so I'll give it to him, and he'll protect all of us. So we assume that this monopoly will not be abused. And this modern democracy was really about the sort of optimism and hopefulness of escaping autocracy, which was arbitrary and abusive. They cut the heads off of kings or murdered them in cellars, not because they were rich. They were rich because they had power, but they eliminated them because they had too much power. They could take away our lives, our children, our family, our property, and that made them rich. But no revolution was fought over unequal incomes or unequal wealth distribution. That's a myth, a fable. They were eliminated because they had too much power. And in fact, so Lenin said, I don't want the czar to have too much power, but I'll take it. You can trust me. This is the problem with revolutions, and also, we're a little bit gullible sometimes. We're susceptible to the sort of illusions of, this rich king, I won't be, of course, I'm going to live it. Well, actually, Lenin actually lived kind of in the sparse conditions in the beginning, but over time, look at the French. He chopped the head off the king, they move into his palace. Most revolutions do that. Well, anyway, so now if we have scarce resources, we have to plan. Like I say, if you're not going to live forever, unlike me, who will, you have to plan your life. My life just goes on. I don't plan anything. Parth asked me to come, so I'll be here in 1,000 years, your great-great-grandchildren. Now, but most people, we need to plan because, we're going to run out of time or we're going to run out of resources. Now, how do we plan? Well, it's interesting. We can leave it to an elite to decide what's good for us, or we can decide for ourselves what is good for us based upon local knowledge, subjective values that only I know. You don't know my values. You say, well, you guys got bad taste in clothing. Everybody should wear long pants or what, So we have to decide, are we going to let individuals be in primary control of their lives, or are we going to hand it over to an elite that pretends to know what is the will of the people, what is the common good? And how do we find what? If there is something known as a common good, how do we discover it? Who knows it? Under what rock does it live? And where's the map to find that? Well, the common good is what makes most of it. Well, I don't want to make a strong utilitarian argument here, but it's what makes most people better off or allows them the possibility to become better off. I read a very good book recently called The House of Government, which was it was referring to an apartment building built during the early Soviet period for the nomenklatura, the privileged class. Now, one by one, they all disappeared. All the, whether it was Bukharin, whoever, at whatever level of Soviet society and politics, almost all of them disappeared, either in a purge or show trials or whatever. Very interesting, because what we found is that when there is a political apparatus that is allowed to decide what is the common good, those who might resist it, criticize it, or somehow be on the wrong side of it, it doesn't turn out very well for them. So, okay, so this is kind of a a very simple and basic framework for the sort of understanding of economics. I hope that most of you would have some sort of sense about. Now, okay, now we're going to talk about economic variations. So now we got sort of a thing. Now, this is kind of a stylized, so real GDP, national income, over time. And what we see is this sort of a peak. So we have, sort of prosperity, growth. And then, we have this sort of downturn. It could be an economic recession or recession. And then, so what we see is that we have this sort of undulating sort of cycle. So this is what we're referring to. So that the measure of the real economic activity might rise and fall. So keep this sort of stylized. And these terms, recession, expansion, recession, these are the kind of terms that we use to reference that. Now, it could be that these are internally generated. In other words, something within the market generates these variations. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that most of them, these can be anticipated. Nothing goes on forever. Kind of an economic law of gravity. Nothing will go on forever. So it could be, the discovery of a new technology, discovery of a new resource, or the depletion of a resource. So, there are things that will influence how we can get on with it. Now, on the other hand, I'm going to propose to you, and I'll try to build this or explain this to you, that the extreme variations come from external factors. And guess what that is? Political governance, fiscal policy or monetary policy or both, some terrible combination of both. So those undulations that I showed you exist as the natural sort of functioning of being human. I'm not I'm perfect, you're not, but people make wrong guesses. Businessmen overexpand. They hope that people will buy more electric vehicles. Whoops, they don't. Whatever it may be. Of course, people were producing electric vehicles not because they thought they would be more people buying, but governments thought more people should buy them. And what happened? Well, those that wanted them bought them, and now everybody's scaling back. So, electrical vehicle production might have had increase in demand for it without government intervention, but with government intervention, lots of electrical and lots of capacity was constructed over it. Whoops. Well, okay. I cheated. I've revealed my biases here to you somehow. Now, okay, so businesses, they miscalculate sometimes. They over-anticipate what you're willing to buy. And that's just human nature. If it's your baby, you say, everybody's going to love this, right? You have this great idea of this wonderful product. Doesn't work sometimes. And of course, you're offset by the guy that has something that's successful. So that kind of moderates, your mistakes. The unexpected successes offset the unexpected failures on balance. Now, what happens when governments get involved, like I said, with the electrical vehicle, what this did was create a concentrated and extensive problem with making errors in judgment. So General Motors or Tesla or whoever were being beaten back by BYD and all these others, initially anyway, because they were subsidized. Their production was subsidized by the Chinese government, perhaps. And in a way, so what we see then is that there are these widespread errors. So that most people in the automobile industry, and they were being told that we're going to not only subsidize electrical vehicles, but we're going to pre-decide the end of internal combustion machines driving automobiles. So I better build today. So I build I start shifting production to electrical vehicles, shutting down plants that have internal combustion machines. So we have big errors. Well, what has this done to the automobile industry, which is a fairly significant, industry, at least in manufacturing still. Now, when I grew up, it was after steel maybe, but these were like, massive, these were hugely important. Now, in economics, when market transactions, markets only exist because people have different values. The only reason any voluntary transaction occurs is that you value more what you receive than what you give up. And the other party does as well. In other words, this is what we call a bull. Now, in a share transaction, a bull is an optimist. So he thinks what you're going to sell to him will go up in value. And the only reason you sell because you think it will go down in value. Or it's just time to sell for whatever reason. So anyway, we have these expressions, optimists and pessimists. So they tend to offset each other. I mean, they have to, or the transaction wouldn't occur. So, and again, at any moment in time, some people might be bulls, sometimes they might be bears, and at any moment, the bears might dominate the bulls, but it has to do with the weather. It might have to do, there was a hurricane in the United States, people worry about, the production there or something, things like that. And I say, well, I don't think it'll be so bad, but I don't know. I just make a prediction. You make a prediction, you get it right. So, but they tend to balance each other out. So the price variations are moderated. Then, when most actors make the same wrong decisions, there's some overriding piece of information that misinforms them. The single most important price in any market economy is the interest rate. Everybody is affected by it, even if you don't. I mean, if you have a credit card, you may not be aware of it, but interest rates influence, if you carry a balance, if you're a home buyer or home seller. So now, everybody's kind of aware, I'm a business person, I'm an investor, I'm a saver, interest rates are a very interesting piece of information, although we just kind of take it for granted. But it moves the entire economy. Now, in a market economy, who decides interest rates? You do, the depositor, because you're making funds available through the banking system, and that provides information to borrowers. You're a saver, you're a creditor, and the borrower is saying, okay, what's the interest rate? Can my business model survive or prosper at the current interest rate? So my business model yields, say, 5%, and the interest rate is 7%. I probably wouldn't borrow because I'm paying more than I would earn. So the interest rate is 3%. I'm in. But and the other thing is, I say, well, when the interest rate's at 3%, that means that many people are deferring their consumption to the future. So that means they want me to produce more for the future when they're ready to recuperate the funds that they've set aside through saving or whatever. So again, there's this market clearing process. And it's sort of a way of bringing together the thinking of the saver creditor with the borrower to bring their sort of perspectives into sort of alignment. Now, when most people are making the wrong decision and whoops, has a lot to do with where the interest rate was. Now, some economists call this a malinvestment, a poor investment, a misinformed investment, that at the time it seemed like the right thing. Well, because the interest rate seemed to indicate that. And in a modern market economy, central banks and political agents have a big influence over interest rates. You no longer are the boss. You know, I made the mistake. I had a couple of $1,000s in a savings account in the US, and I went away for a while, and I came back, and the interest payments were like 35 cents. When I was a kid, I would have had real money. I could have bought a good meal. Not only could I not buy a pack of cigarettes for 35 cents, I couldn't buy a cigarette for 35 cents. Well, what's the incentive to save? When central banks drive down interest rates, it punishes the saver. Or, people like me, pensioners. So this leads to these exacerbated cycles. Most people are making the wrong decision. And whoops, because eventually central bankers have to let the interest rates go up. And when you borrowed at 3% and they go up to 7%, you're out. And I'm sitting there going, I'm going to buy your capital at a discount because you screwed up. And that's the sort of optimistic side of it, because when capital escapes from being misused or misallocated, then it provides an opportunity for somebody that says, wow, there's an opportunity to make a profit. You know, many of my family members were property developers and housing developers. And unfortunately, they failed every time. But in doing so, they made opportunities for other people. Somehow they've recovered. Bless you. Or Gesundheit or whatever. Anyway. So, I mean, what happened is that either they were ahead of their time or they were victimized by the central bankers. Because I told them, I said, look, do not construct any speculative property because we're in a housing bubble. Alan Greenspan said there's no housing bubble. There's only froth in some markets. What does he know? He didn't know nothing. He knew nothing. Well, he was the central banker, so he's not going to tell you. And then they lost everything. And I lost a lot, but that's another story. I'm still here. But this is what happens. You know, people make mistakes, but then if those resources or capital can escape from those people who were misallocating it, then that's the road to recovery. So now, what we see, now I haven't updated this. I did this a couple of years ago, maybe. 88 recessions, and they've been happening with greater frequency. 62 were preceded by excessive valuation of shares, housing, or both. A lot of, stock markets, share markets, housing, these are the location of some of the biggest imbalances. So that they, as you see there, now Japan, from the end of World War II until the 1989, Japan embarked on export-led growth. India wasn't around to compete. Well, they were around, but not competing. China, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, Europe they had it all to themselves. I mean, and of course, Japan begins, ceramics, toys, hand tools. Not a big threat to, certainly not in the U.S. And also, by the way, the West wanted Japan to get stronger to offset China. So they didn't worry about what they imported from Japan. Anyway, wasn't very good quality. When I was a kid, if something broke, we made a joke and said, oh, it must be made in Japan. And now we have Honda or Toyota. But what we saw back then was that Japan was no threat. So there's no model that tells us that exports are the way to grow. Adam Smith's great tome, The Wealth of Nations, was really an attack on mercantilism. Japan pretended, they said, oh, neo-mercantilism, it's new mercantilism, and it works. Well, it didn't work. Well, it did work until 1989, when the bubble economy of Japan collapsed on them. And what happened? 2/3 of the value of the share market, 2/3 of commercial property evaporated. It was until this year, by the way, this is 2024, Japan's, the Nikkei industrial average was 30, I forget the number, let's say 34%. It only got back up to that sometime this year. Oh, it's only 3 decades. Took them a while. Devastation. So anyway, how did they get there? Well, first of all, they believed the nonsense about export-led growth being a model. And then, well, by the way, I was famous for 5 minutes because I said, well, anybody that would follow that model is going to end up in the same boat as Japan, which East Asia did, Southeast Asia did, until 1997. And the book that I had written starting in 1992 came out in 1997. Stupid luck. I didn't predict the timing. I just said it was inevitable. So it's not a model. It was circumstantial. It was geopolitics. It was, you know. And then I said, China is next, was what I said. Now, so I predicted that China would eventually face the same kind of, you know. I never realized that every central bank in the world would prop up China's export-led growth model by doing stupid things. Negative interest rates, quantitative easing. Where did all that come from? Japan. Right after the 1989 collapse of the Japanese economy, the Japanese said, we're good, well, they didn't say this, but good Keynesians. So, wow, interest rates need to be lowered, stimulate economic activity. Well, that didn't work. Interest rates go lower. Well, that didn't work. I kept going. Now, when I was getting my PhD, I took monetary theory. I'm sitting in the back of the class. Obviously, I didn't do this. But I raised my hand and said, Professor, I had a dream last night that we would have in modern industrial economies negative nominal interest rates. Okay, just a moment. Campus police, I've got a guy in the back of the room. He needs to be taken off. There's something nutty about this guy. Nobody believed that was even conceivably possible, much less Christine Lagarde of the European Central Bank said it was a great idea. So, China's been able to do what they've done in some way. I mean, they on their own, they certainly allowing greater possibility of markets. But the capacity for that model to be sustained has a lot to do with central banks creating excess liquidity that found its way into the banking system, that went to Walmart, that went to China to buy that stuff, or Carrefour, or whatever it may be, Lotus. So China's sort of economic correction is being forestalled, but it's going to be inevitable. We began to see it with the housing developers, but it's inevitable. There's too many imbalances, too many distortions built in for them to be able to survive it. So what we see then is that these economic crises. Now, but wait a minute. After World War II, we invented the International Monetary Fund. We developed macroeconomic policies to avoid these things. That's the whole point of it. But the more of those things that we got, the more of those problems we got. Wait a minute. Something's wrong. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah. I've got one too, but you go first.
So,
Sorry.
I'm just trying to sort of separate the third part that you were talking about, which
Mm.
is, let's say, export-led growth,
Mm.
right? And how these two
Mm.
things impact
Mm.
export-led growth.
Yeah.
But there is a genuine sort of impact of competitive advantage leading to trade,
Mm.
and some countries having competitive advantage in
Mm.
certain sort of
Yeah, sure.
activities, and that can be a perfectly good model for growth, right?
If you have the comparative advantage, the state doesn't intervene to support or protect it.
Yes.
You know, they were joking about, I think Mohit's talked about some industry. The American steel industry was being, that happened the other day, was being protected under infant industry from the very beginning, and still. So, I mean, it's a nonsense argument. If you truly have a comparative advantage, you don't need the state to intervene.
Agreed.
And one of the other things that people seem to neglect in understanding what Adam Smith was talking about is that the way to grow is through imports. Because if you import, your producers have to compete with the best. And your consumers have access to cheaper things to spend. They can buy cheaper things from abroad to buy more of what's produced locally. So this is the way to grow. I mean, it's not to say to block exports, but it's to let it operate organically. And if you do, the consumers will be better off because and they'll have access to better things, more choices. I mean, India. You know, the ambassador, when I first came here, nobody had an imported car. Nobody had a Suzuki. Nobody, I mean, you know, they were protecting us. And who was harmed? The Indian consumer. The only people, this is the thing that irritated me, the only people that had a foreign-made car were former diplomats. What is that? I mean, they're supposed to be your servants. And what happens? Well, they get these privileges that you can't have access to.
Just to
He's not finished.
yeah, just to understand that. So if the state agrees on, let's say, inflation targeting,
Hmm.
because
Why? Do you know the magic rate of inflation?
no,
Oh, 3%,
yeah,
2.9%.
yeah,
What? Sorry.
yeah. But let's assume that you
No, let's don't assume, but go ahead.
sure. But if you have an agreed inflation target, right?
But
And
why do you? I'm sorry. Why? I mean, where did this idea come from? Who knows what the correct rate of inflation is? And again, what that does is influence what they do to affect credit availability, interest rates, and so on, as though they know they're central planners. But anyway, go ahead.
does that not help us safeguard against, let's say, because the way government tries to do it is push easy money behind industries,
Yeah.
right?
Like Japan did in
Like
1989. Okay.
exactly, right? And keep these industries in sort of unproductive sort of vocations, so to speak. If I have an inflation target, then the amount of quantitative easing that I can do will get limited.
No, again, I have to ask the question: why do they have inflation targeting? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. It's just like, setting prices. It's like, most economists will say they don't believe in price fixing or price ceilings or price floors, but they think, oh, inflation targeting. Well, what is that? You're imagining that I mean, individual prices are complicated enough to sort out, but price levels, which are supposed to reflect the buying and selling of a myriad of goods and services, it's complete nonsense. I'm sorry. Now, you're right. I mean, your logic was perfectly correct. Well, if we do this, then quantitative easing flows easily from that. Well, but Japan's been doing that since 1989. They would get 1 quarter where they were having a recovery, and they go, wah, and then it would collapse. And they go, oh, we have to have a. Now, Japan has over 300% debt to GDP ratio because they kept borrowing money, throwing it at them, and it did not work. Now, Western central bankers pretend like that never happened. So it was a New Zealand central bank that came up with this idea of inflation targeting, a tiny little country in the middle of nowhere that has very little impact on the overall economy of the world. And then they follow them, well, because it was convenient. But it has no economic support behind it. I'm sorry. Those guys are smarter than me. They have better degrees than me, but they're wrong. They're wrong. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a country which doesn't try to set interest rates?
That what?
That doesn't try to set interest rates, where there's no central bank that tries to.
Well, I mean, like Hong Kong or Singapore, or they have like monetary, um, um, currency, but or monetary authorities, but generally, they most do. Well, in the United States, there were two big debates during the 19th century. Should we have a central bank? Well, let's try one. Nah. Let's try another one. Nah. And then, through very clever marketing, we developed a Federal Reserve System. We don't have a central bank. And, it was all, it had to be sneaked in. The other big debate was a standing army. Now, one supports the other. And we got the worst of both worlds. You have a standing army. It's like you have a cricket. You play cricket. No, you got to play cricket. He's a Russian spy. How can it's like a Frenchman doesn't like cheese. I mean, who plays cricket? Okay, if you buy a cricket ball, what do you do with it? You leave it in the closet? No. You have a standing army. What do? Yeah. You got to do something with it. It's terrible. People hate America. And the only way we can afford a standing army, well, it's not the only way, but it certainly helps. Have a central bank. Helps facilitate running budget deficits, creating debt, and so on. Yes, sir.
Just to set the context on when you said that East Asia and other East Asian countries, they subsidize their producers at the cost of their consumers. Like for and basically production levels were going up. Import was not allowed for a lot of
production was going up for foreigners to consume.
Correct. So basically it was export. In India, what we did was that we basically disincentivized both production and consumption. So that's like
Yeah.
So just to put that.
I know. Well, that actually India wasn't alone. I mean, there were a lot of countries that engaged in that sort of, and part of it was driven by anti-colonial logic. Another number of things that I think that influenced the decisions of policymakers to do really bad things for their people. But always one of the things I was going to mention, I guess, was it Mohit's discussion? One of our presidents said that the sentence that frightens him most is that I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And my reaction to that is the most frightening expression by government officials is, I'm doing it for the poor. Because they're picking your back pocket and they're lining their own pocket or their vote bank. So, I mean, we need to be alert to these things, which is part of what I'm trying to get you to think about here. So, but what we see is that despite all these, again, these are deeply intelligent people that come up with quantitative easing and all this. These are smart people. But Marx was a smart guy, very smart. John Maynard Keynes was very smart. There are a lot of smart people, but they might miss something, and that's what I'm trying to suggest to you. So what do we do with this? The IMF is there to protect us, to stop the reason Rao and Manmohan Singh embarked on this sort of attack on the license Raj was because they were having a foreign exchange crisis. They didn't do it because they loved the Indian people, but they didn't have a choice. Franco did it in Spain. It happened to a lot of countries where, it's not because they loved you. They just, hey, what can we do now? Well, the only way out was now. So the IMF may have done some things to force some hands, but they didn't stop the frequency of these extreme variations. So since 1970s, there's banking crises, there's currency crises, sovereign debt crises, and there are ones out there waiting to happen. I mean, we have the largest, what I would call a global debt bubble. The amount of borrowing and the outstanding debt that's overwhelming the capacity for governments to pay sooner or later. Now, Greece went into crisis some years back because they simply borrowed too much. In other words, they didn't generate enough tax revenue to pay off the interest. I mean, how much can you get from selling feta cheese? I mean, come on. Olive oil, tourism. That's it. But they were borrowing at German rates of interest to support a much less developed economy. And they were wasting the money. They weren't, again, we're doing it for improving infrastructure. That's the other thing that should frighten you. Governments that say, we're going to improve infrastructure. In the U.S., every other year they say, we have this money, we're going to spend it on infrastructure. We need more money because we have crumbling infrastructure. Wait a minute. Where did that go? It doesn't happen. So these are false promises. Where did it go? It went to transfer payments.
You forgot one.
No.
It's for the children.
That's really become a political issue. Okay, so this is stylized thing. So we see more crises, but we shouldn't have them. We have the IMF, we have the World Bank, what's happening? What's the trend? Down? We got, I lived through, all of these. Most of them are obscure to you, but, the Asian crisis. So we have, advanced economies are affected. And then we begin to see the advanced economy and the emerging markets, before, the 1980s, they weren't very important in terms of overall activity. So we begin seeing them move in tandem. Yeah.
On this, actually, there's an interesting insight by Ruchir Sharma, who's recently written a book on this, where he says, because of quantitative easing and all free money that's sort of sloshing through the system, the peaks have gotten higher and the recoveries have gotten flatter.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right.
But inherently, he's arguing that recessions are not a bad thing, that just business cycles are a part of the way the world is.
Recessions are not a bad thing, but they are avoidable. What's happened is that these guys, they say, I'm a central banker. We need low interest rates. I'm a Keynesian. We need low interest rates. Keynesian want them in order to boost, stimulate the economy. Sorry if I'm using, John Maynard Keynes was an economist who promoted deficit spending where governments would spend more than they received in revenues. So they say, and they do that because they're going to stimulate the economy. Monetarists say, we lower interest rates, that will stimulate. Okay. Now, what happens is that creates these malinvestments, these overshoots, which he described. And then, in other words, that recession would have been avoidable had they not done that. But once we get there and we start on the downward path, they say, we need to borrow more. We need more deficit spending because, look, we have a recession. And that's a good thing. Well, no, but the good thing is, where were the people that said, zero interest rate policy? That's daft. Negative, it's criminal. No, they went along with it.
Do you feel like, take a 100-year period, and you have, with this kind of policy, it's a bumpy ride. And without, maybe there's less variance. But in which case do you think overall there would be more growth?
Again, where there was less government trying to force the economy into a position that was unsustainable. That's what these bubbles are. These policies create unsustainable conditions, and the downturn is where the misery comes. And then they say, trust us, we're going to fix it. Well, you shouldn't have done what you did to start with. They created that sort of overshoot that they are then asking for your permission or your support to solve the problem. And again, we're not holding them accountable for those mistakes, and partly economists' fault. Now, you think they would hire me to give them advice on this? Well, first of all, I'm not smart enough. I don't have the right degrees. And I'm too honest on the other hand. Well, so they could dismiss me as like, well. But the other guys are really smart, and they tell them what they want to hear. Now, who are they going to hire? Of course. Incentives matter. That's something I should have put on the first slide. economists, one of the first things you understand is how incentives influence people's behavior. So this is why this cycle continues. If we, when we had like a gold standard of sound money, there were cycles. If there was a new gold discovery, then there would be an overshoot in the money supply that would create. Okay, but those were sort of random events, and it was recoverable in a way that this is really problematic.
So speaking about incentives, right, the political economy aspect of it plays a major role, because when the government does not know if it's going to sit for another term, during the term, for the next election, they need to show that there was a hype during the term. So that sort of dictates why they do take more.
No, the thing is, they don't have an incentive to suggest that their policies are going to lead. Yeah.
Right before
Yeah.
These
Okay.
elections in India,
Yeah.
the currency was kept artificially low for a really long time, because you don't want to show that they have reduced the
Yeah.
currency value in the last 2 years. So that is part of it. So
What do you do? Okay, so again, there's just crises and I have several pet peeves. Crisis was a term that a good economist used rarely, and it was to describe like the Great Depression. Well, there weren't a lot of those, maybe some in the 19th century. The only people who said they were economists that used crisis with any kind of regularity were Marxists. The crisis of capitalism, that sort of thing. So I did what JSTOR is? I did a search of the literature, just kind of a casual one. And sure enough, crisis wasn't used very often, certainly not by mainstream or good economists, until about 1984 when the Latin American debt crisis, and then it became used to describe everything. Well, crisis means you need help. And who's there to help you? Central banks, fiscal authorities. Became convenient. So, of course, journalists began using it, maybe intentionally or unintentionally, but it served to allow people to say, we need the state to sort this out. It's a crisis. Well, who caused it? That was never asked. Well, again, I'm asserting, I haven't given you an argument of how they caused it, but I'm suggesting to you that they did cause it through irresponsible fiscal policy, borrowing too much, borrowing beyond what their capacity to pay. Now, Japan gets away with it. When Greece had a problem, I think the debt to GDP ratio was about 60 to 70%, whereas Japan's is 300%, let's say. Well, Toyota, Honda, feta cheese, olive oil. Where's your revenues come from? Okay. Now, tax revenues. Yeah. Okay. So, bubbles. What's a bubble? Well, prices are unsustainably high. In other words, we're in a situation where the most likely direction of change of prices is down. How do we get there? Well, of course, if you look at the price of oil, it goes up and down, right? Or Bitcoin goes up and down. So prices do move, but what we see with the bubble is that these are prices which large volumes of trade at very high prices, and there's no market fundamental behind it. It's based on expectations, often generated by artificially low interest rates primarily, so that people jump in. So housing bubbles, people found it cheap to buy a house. And there were other regulatory issues in America that allowed that. Yeah. Oh.
Apologies for
Yeah.
interrupting.
Don't. And that was one thing I liked. I remember the early speakers, you guys are ultra polite. You would say, sorry, no, I need to apologize to you. Don't apologize. If you have a question, ask a bloody question. But thank you for being polite.
The intrinsic value, right? To believe that there is every good has a specific intrinsic value is you deciding on someone else's behalf how they value them.
Good
right?
point.
So how do we state involvement in pricing? For example, the Bitcoin
Mm,
bubble, so to speak, where the prices just shot up because there was a lot of bullish behavior behind it, and then it crashed, right? Now, how do you decide when the volume of trade is higher than something's
Yeah.
intrinsic value?
Well, we call that generally the bigger sucker theory. In other words, I pay too much, but I believe he's going to be a sucker and he'll pay more. As long as there's always a bigger fool, someone that's misjudging. The problem is,
I mean, the word risk
the thing,
puts a
yeah,
value judgment to it.
okay, you're the decision maker. Now, one of the problems, because the school of thought in economics that I identify with, but have no training in, is often attacked because we talk about these malinvestments, these poor choices. They say, yeah, but businessmen do this. You know, well, but why do they do it? It's because they don't know. They can't know. Now, are people buying more from me because of the low interest rates or because I have a good product? And will the fact that they're buying allow me to produce at a never-ending rising stream? You really don't know. And, you know, what are you going to, okay, I'm going to wait 5 years until the market soars. You take a dive. You don't know if it's you or if it's him. Maybe it was my business model. You really don't know. So the mistakes are made not because we're just not omniscient. We can't see the future. We make the best judgment with what we have. And unfortunately, one of the things that we have is inflation targeting and QE. And the things are happening in the economy that we're not sure whether we're, you know, the beneficiary of that false level of interest rates or changing consumer preferences.
So without QE, there won't be a bubble.
Sorry?
Without a quantitative easing or state.
Well, or I mean, without something like that, yeah, without artificially low interest rates, without credit expansions and so on, we won't have extreme variations. We'll have these sort of moderate, you know, overshoots that are usually corrected because most people are basing their information on, you know, basing their judgments on what information is available. The difference is in this world is that a big chunk of that information is where interest rates. And they're wrong. You know, the interest rates is supposed to indicate to the saver that it's worth saving, that you'll be compensated for foregoing current consumption. And in doing so, you're alerting the borrower that you'll have funds, that you'll participate in the consumption of what they produce in the future as a general concept.
But then there are this whole host of alternate assets: watches, shoes, comic books,
Yeah.
cards.
I'm
right?
missing something, yeah.
And let's say NFTs, which was more recent, right? Where there are prices that just when you look at it, why should a MLB card go for like $1 million? Right?
Yeah, yeah.
So do you call that a bubble or do you call that?
Yeah, of course that's a bubble. And the thing is, we don't live in a world where, you know, savers are the most influential determinant of interest rates. I mean, and of course, what determines the amount of savings? Well, productivity, generation of surpluses. So saving is the fuel for economic growth. And entrepreneurs are the engine, the driver of it. So what we see then is that, you know, these savings are usually inspired by, you know, this capacity to save and the anticipation that your savings won't disappear in a puff of smoke called price inflation. But these bubbles that you've described, you know, I don't know if you remember what were these things? They were financial instruments that were developed during, huh?
The subprime crisis?
Yeah, during that, but I'll think about these instruments named. There's a term.
Credit default swaps.
Huh?
Credit default swaps.
Well, yeah, okay. All these, none of these things would have ever materialized if we hadn't had that massive amount of excess liquidity. So what happened is that commercial bankers said, God, people are putting money in our bank. Not only do we have to give them the money back, we have to give them some amount of interest. So we have to do something with it. So they hire a smart guy from MIT, has no background in economics. He's a quantitative guy. So he say, invent something. So they did. They invented all these financial instruments that had never been used before. And because they had to do something with the money. And meanwhile, they hire him. He knows nothing about mortgage or the property market, but we need to get the money out the door. So you make loans to people who want to borrow for housing. And you say, well, I'll get promoted if I make more loans. So I come in, I say, I don't make much money. He said, well, you know, we'll figure that out. So we had come up with liar loans and all kinds of stuff like that. All this stuff came out because there was excess liquidity. Where did it come from? Well, central bank policy. It would never have happened. Now, at the end of that crisis, people thought they need to put those commercial bankers in jail because they did. No, wait, they were victims. They need to put those liars in jail. No, they were victims. They were victims of the central bankers. They're the ones that you put in jail because they created the conditions for all this misbehavior. There's no incentive for central banks to come up with this nonsense unless.
So I'm a lawyer, so that's a disclaimer for the fact that I want to know like you said, you started your slide with saying they didn't start at scarcity. So everything that I know and read about monetary policy is how can it be done better? Is your talk hitting at why monetary policy at all? So I just want to understand that bit a little bit better. Why?
Yeah. Yeah, I grew up, when I grew up, there was a gold standard in the international exchange for the American dollar. And through the Bretton Woods, it kind of was an implicit standard because everything was linked, most things were linked to the dollar, which was linked to gold for international purposes. Now that constrained central bankers from doing really stupid things because if they produced too many dollars went overseas. The French, which they did, wanted gold for it. Bloody French, you can't trust them. Now, so the gold stocks were depleted, so sooner or later they were going to have to do something. So what did they do? They ended the gold standard. Of course, it was government officials, because otherwise they'd have to, reduce spending or, Now, so what was happening then is that central bank policy was not getting out of hand because there was an anchor. Now, after 1971, it ended August 15th, 1971. And it was, again, this is another thing about governments. It's temporary. You should know right away it's not. But anyway. Now, it took time for central bankers to test the waters. Now, the guys that were there, they had been raised by Milton Friedman and all these other, and they knew what, was good and bad about central banking. But they didn't realize that there weren't good central bankers. There was a system that made them good central bankers. But over time, they kept testing if they could misbehave. It's like a child, stepping outside of the garden, And eventually, we got to the point where, inflation targeting, quantitative easing, zero interest rates. Well, they never would have done that. There's no way they would have done that if there was a sound money, commodity-based money system. We'd never have gotten there. So now, am I suggesting we go back to a gold standard? It's very difficult now because when I was a child, gold was money. There was actually coins that circulated. And now, if you had a $5 gold coin, it would be about that big. Back then, it was, the size of my thumb. You could actually carry. It would be, of course, if it's done through digital transfers, or you have a stock of gold, that would work. I mean, that's something that wasn't possible then. The problem is central banks, fundamentally. I mean, we really need to find a way. Now, we did find a way. It hasn't developed or matured fully yet, but it's called cryptocurrencies. this was a response of the market to the capacity of central banks to misbehave and realizing there was no escape otherwise. They're not going to do free banking, we called it, was one way so that, that you don't need a central bank, that banks have to compete and that, the market regulates it or the gold standard. They're not going to agree to that. So the market said, well, we know you're not going to let us, you're going to keep us trapped. We're going to look for a way out. And this is how cryptocurrencies developed. Now, I don't need to discuss if it's perfect and working, but anyway, that's why we have it.
My question is basically, central bank is supposed to be an independent institution, but then.
Well, again, this was discussed as a student. I mean, that was kind of this expression, that was the gold standard. That applies to everything except the gold standard. That's not the gold standard. A PCR test, that's the gold. Well, okay. Now, this idea of central bank independence. Now, it seemed to be relevant. Like when Margaret Thatcher was in power in Britain, they were trying to force the Bank of England to be independent of Treasury and all. Well, of course, now there is more, certainly legislative independence in most countries, but in fact, it's a myth. I've actually published an article on this. Not only are they not independent of the fiscal authorities, they're not independent of each other. Because whatever the Fed does, most people, they don't call it the Fed. What are you going to do? They just follow them. It's not an agreement, but this is what happens. So there's no real independence. The reason that the Federal Reserve moved to cut interest rates again is because the cost of borrowing in the United States became insupportable in the sense of, it was eating up more and more of the budget just to pay the interest. Because most debt is not repaid, it's rolled over. And it's rolled over at the current market interest rate. So that's the problem. Maturity, it's a big issue with debt.
So can we say in one way that cryptocurrencies, specifically Bitcoin, are even slightly better than gold? Reason being, because you know that the supply is limited and you are not going to get supply beyond a particular point.
So some asteroid, Musk won't bring back too much gold from an asteroid or something. Yeah, well, the physicality of gold is a problem. You got to put it somewhere. It has, just, you can't keep it at home. Most people don't. Now, the thing with cryptocurrencies, what worries me about them is that the governments can shut down the internet. The governments have so much money, they can, mess up the market by buying it and dumping it, buying it and dumping it. So there's lots of problems with it. But I suspect most of those problems will be overcome sooner or later because, people have an incentive to find a way. Markets are government-proof. They find a way to solve the problem because markets are you and me. Markets aren't some sort of thing like the blackboard exists. It's you and me trying to find a way to make our lives better. Yeah.
Technically, you can use Bitcoin offline as well if you have the right.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Things will develop. So I think there's escapes, but the way I look at it, you have to think about. There's a big debate among economists. Bitcoin isn't money. Well, the dollar isn't money. Now, when I had money with gold, I get to go to a bank or the treasury, and I get gold, or in America, we could get silver. That's money. Now, I go to the bank now, I say, I've got this dollar bill, I want to transfer it. And they say, okay, here's another dollar bill. What happened? Nothing happened. Now, in the old days, if I got gold out of the market, that would affect the economy because I would put it in my pocket and say, you can't have it. I'm using it. I'm saving it because I think the government's going to, devalue the currency. So that had real impact. Prices would go up, interest rates would go up. Prices would go down, interest rates would go up. So it had real effect. So we don't have money anymore. So I don't worry about cryptocurrency being money. You say, well, it's not used. it can be used as a medium of exchange. That's the primary thing that most people think of as money. It's just a medium of exchange. But a cowrie shell used to be, right? Well, but it wasn't money because you just got another cowrie shell or you got things. So money is really commodity money. I mean, all the monetary theory was really about commodity money. It wasn't about currencies, that is debt. I mean, because the rupee, well, some of it is completely worthless. Yeah. I'm sorry?
You can get it exchanged.
Oh, yeah? Oh, good. I'll give it to someone and they can. I don't know. I've got 5 or 6 of them. Anyway, so the thing, I don't get in that debate about cryptocurrencies being, Bitcoin being money. We don't have money anymore. These instruments that we call money are debt, which is never redeemed. Now, if I was a commercial bank and I issued paper gold, that is paper backed by gold, if I was a government that issued paper gold, then that debt would be redeemed in gold. So that no longer happens. But, anyway, I mean, crypto is, I think, an escape. And I encourage my students to buy at $300. I told you I'm not very smart. I didn't. They did. They were smart.
Coming back to her question on, do the ends justify the means? For example, let's say because of all of this cheap money floating through the Japanese economy, they got rich, and now they're better
Well,
rich
yeah.
than poor.
Well, they got rich because nobody was competing with them. See, that's what troubles me about, what happened is that when the crash in Japan occurred at the end of the bubble economy in 1989, Japan was a rich economy, partly because they got rich selling in a world market where nobody was competing with them. Now, China is still a poor country. If it collapses, I mean, it's a rich government, but it's a poor country. China's per capita income is quite low.
But that's not strictly true, right? When Japan was trying to compete, Germany was still trying to compete and come up.
Different products. I mean, they were producing BMWs and Mercedes. They had a long history of Volkswagen and Japan. The first Honda automobile had a motorcycle engine in it I mean, it's a different market.
So they were producing that no one else wanted to produce, which is the competitive advantage argument, right?
Exactly, but again, there were other factors involved in that. Geopolitics meant that if trade unions complained about the import of Japanese products, governments were less likely to intervene on their behalf. They said it's more important we have Japan against China. So a lot of other factors, not just the.
Would Japan today be poor and stable versus rich but have these problems? Like at the end, are they still richer and better?
Well, again, all those other factors had to be in alignment for Japan to get richer in that way.
Other Asian economies have followed a similar model to reasonable success, right? Even with China today, China and India started on the same path in the 1990s, same per capita income. Today they are 5, if not 7x richer than we are.
Yeah, but
That's a great point. There's one thing that it misses, and I have not seen any industrial policy proponent have a response to this. That if you really look at industrial policy, the returns to industrial policy have been declining over the years. So Japan, then Korea, and then you will get, and then you'll get like Southeast Asia, which isn't really, and then China. So, so if you basically, if you have a playbook and you're trying to follow that playbook, but everybody knows that you're cheating, right? The first instance you don't get caught, the first country doesn't get caught, second country a little bit more, and then there onwards everybody's like, we can't allow that.
To begin with, I'm not a proponent of industrial policy,
Well,
but I'm just stress testing my
so
ideas here.
you described.
I'm not saying you are one, but basically.
No, but you described what I tried to explain in my book. I said, Japan is not a model. It was an accident of happenstance, circumstance, and luck. Okay? So it got rich partly because of that. success, as I say, has a lot to do, the level of success has a lot to do with central bank policies that kept so much liquidity in, that allowed them to export so much, because Walmart had to buy somewhere. Yeah.
Anand, bubble is also partly driven by market psychology. Like there are periods of fads when the market is extremely
Sure,
optimist, and
sure.
there are periods of pessimism.
Yeah.
When there
Well,
is bearish and bullish. So.
but the thing is, if one price goes up and there's not extra liquidity in the market, another price has to go down. The test is, are most prices going up? Whoops. Now, you're right. The fad, like the dot-com bubble in the late 1990s, well, you know, other things didn't go down in price because there was excess liquidity that was driving that bubble. So that's, you know, you're right, but you have to understand that in a market economy without an intervention of central bank, if a fad drives up the price of something, other things have to go down because there's a fixed supply of the medium of exchange. Yeah. Sorry, I think you had your hand up earlier. And
Yeah. So, how do you think we can promote long-term growth without probably encouraging bubbles or have like artificial expansion? Like,
Listen to
what's the
me.
best way to do it?
and pay me lots of money.
And
Well,
then,
the thing is, I think one of the things is we have to trust the infallibility of human, which means let people get on with it. The thing is, government officials, many of them really don't trust your fallibility. I may have said infallibility. Your ability to make mistakes. I have to be willing to trust that you will be smart enough. Well, if you're really smart, you learn from my mistakes. But we hope you're smart enough to learn from your mistakes and correct them. And I think most government officials don't trust humanity. They'll make a mess of things, but I will balance it out. So I think giving people more capacity to get on with it is important. So that means deregulation. Now, government deregulation, because markets regulate behavior. One of the biggest regulators of market behavior is called reputation or brand. You know, it's huge. So Nike is terrified that any of their suppliers will use child labor under slave-like conditions because it affects their. The only thing Nike owns is a brand. They don't own any manufacturing. They have some people they hire to design stuff, but they protect that brand. So, and lower taxes. That is, governments don't need to regulate so much, so they don't need so many. So I think these are the sort of very broad things, but let me answer some other questions. But I could give you some other points. Wait.
My question is like, wouldn't be a good idea to abolish the right of monopoly of issuing currency of central bank?
Yeah.
Shouldn't there be competition like other?
Yeah, again, when I was younger and not more naive, I said, there are alternatives to the central bank and free banking and gold standards, commodity standards. It doesn't have to be gold. It could be a basket of commodities, blah, blah, blah. I said, no, they'll never allow it because they have to say, okay, we give up the monopoly over the issue of currency. They're not going to do it. And that's why crypto, sent a shot across the bow. And that's why they came up with, central bank, digital currencies. So people will think, oh, that's like Bitcoin. Well, it's not. It's about control. You should be terrified that central banks are going to force this on us. And of course, it's convenient for you and your life will be better until the government decides that you've bought too much old par, that you've, driven your car too much, either with electric or whatever, and they shut off your access to your money. So having those people continue, they're going to control more of our lives. I mean, it's almost inevitable. Thank God. Well, I was joking before, but I'll be dead when you guys have to solve those problems. That's the only solace I have in this. Because this is coming down. I mean, who's opposing it? No, there's certainly very few politicians that are opposing central bank digital currencies. None that I know of. Yeah.
This going down this path requires sort of universal consensus, because as long as other countries or some countries try and sort of because thinking of it from a game theoretic model, right? There is always the incentive is to deflect if everyone else complies, right? So if all countries, let's say, come back and say, okay, we will not do monetary easing, will not do industrial policy, there is incentive for one country to deflect, and you're in this downward spiral where we find ourselves.
You know what you're saying in a way depends on what you really what you believe about how democratic preferences are revealed. Now, most people you know are in either a Congress supporter or a BJP supporter. Now, how many of them are going to shift from one party to another? Now, what do you think? Does the individual voter determine the policy of the BJP? Does the individual voter that supports Congress determine their policies? It goes the other way. It goes the other way. If you're a BJP supporter, you're kind of like, you're waiting to hear what they believe so you can support them. So voters are not driving the political decisions. The political decisions are made by the party leaders that we have attached ourselves to. Few people migrate. I mean, there's a few nutters like me that might want the freedom, what's it called, the Freedom Party. There was one in Rajasthan years ago. Yeah, but what happens is, this is one of the tragic realities of democracy, is that we follow what is primarily given to us by the political leadership. Well, okay.
No, but I'm not even talking about democracies, right? I'm saying at
Well, you are. I mean, if it's a
political.
political.
No, I'm saying at an international level, there are democracies and all sorts of regimes, right? And
Well, they're all democracies.
Sure.
They say they are. Okay.
With 99% success.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so there is this incentive for countries, because all countries are trying to get rich before they get old, essentially, right? Because if you get old and you're poor, then you're in for a lot of trouble.
Anyway, yeah. Okay. Go ahead. But I mean, there's Venezuela. There's all kinds of anomalies, and they don't care about any of that. But
so if that is the race, then there will be incentive for some countries to deflect, because let's say Russia might come in and say, oh, all these guys want to play fair, not do any monetary policy, not do any fiscal easing. Let me incentivize industries to come and set up in Russia.
Terrible idea. Look, I mean, political determinations of incentivizing and so on are terrible, because they're going to reflect the preferences of the political elite, a partisan sort of perspective, or whatever is necessary to get the vote bank. It is not about doing the right thing. There's the common good, to promote the general world. These things to me are really problematic. So now, I didn't get very far, but I did give you a sort of a framework of what I wanted to produce, or to share with you. So this thing about bubbles and variations, this is the end of the bigger sucker theory, when people stop buying into it. So we have all these historic bubbles. I began living with some of these later. I mean, I wasn't there for the Roman Empire, but as I say, I wrote about the East Asian bubble and all these other things. So these things happen. I mean, Bitcoin is all over the map. Bitcoin's variations, I think, have a lot to do with, whales. The whales are probably central banks moving in and out of the market to try to, disincentivize people from buying in. So government policies create moral hazard. Now, central bank policy is one of them. But, what they've done, fiscal authorities or the International Monetary Fund will create this sort of, we'll pay it off for you. Now, this all started back in 19 1984, when a lot of Latin American countries borrowed more than they were able to pay back. Why? Well, I was living in Luxembourg at the time. Luxembourg was becoming a international banking center, partly because it was a way of tax evasion back then, not now. Anyway, so I had lunch with this woman who was representative for one of the German banks. She said, well, we'll lend them whatever they want because it's a government, they can pay it off in taxes. And I said, are you out of your mind? You know, well, 2 weeks later, they all collapsed. You know, why? They didn't generate enough tax revenue. Right? They were like Greece, 30 years later. They couldn't pay it back. And so, but these banks were enthusiastic because they were deluded in believing that. So if that German bank, which by the way was a Landesbank, was a bank owned by one of the states, federal states of Germany, of course. So that was taxpayer money that they repaid. Now, the reason there was a collapse in Southeast Asia in 1997 was that most of the governments had an official exchange rate. So, we will exchange our currency at a fixed rate no matter what. Well, no matter until we can't do it, which is what happened. Because what would happen is people would say, okay, that means that if I borrow dollars, I'll get back, I only need the same number of Thai baht or, Indonesian rupiah to, pay back. So I could lend it to you. So I borrow on the dollar market or the yen market at 3%, lend it to you in the rupiah market as a Indonesian for 10%. Ah, I'm rich. Well, that works as long as the exchange rate, as long as the central bank can keep the exchange rate where it was. Well, they can't, not forever, because the more people that borrowed, you begin to see these imbalances grow. So, and they expected the World Bank to pay it off. I went by, starting in 1984, the IMF in particular began to, forgive debt or, okay, 5 minutes. So basically, central banks cannot be trusted. Partly because they're so smart. I mean, they really are smart guys, but they talk to each other. And so they reassure each other. I get a newsletter from the bank. It's one of the lesser banks in a way, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. And it starts with a question. Did the Federal Reserve cause, or, are our policies, and of course, these are smart guys. They say, no, we didn't do it. These imbalances, and they give some other argument. Every one of them is laughable. I stopped reading them. But they're smart guys. And I mean, they really make, for some people, compelling, say, well, that makes sense. It doesn't make sense. But it's all based, they use macroeconomic theory to support their arguments. Now, the problem is, macroeconomic theory is a little bit like I mentioned Marx tried to construct his policy in the air. Well, macroeconomic policy is rather like that. Microeconomic policy is about how you behave. Macroeconomic policy is some sort of high-level abstraction about how economies behave. I don't understand that. I mean, an economy is all of you guys, and you're moving in different directions. And how do I really come up with a meaningful interpretation of these behavior? Now, we do it, and I'm guilty of it to a certain degree, but it really leads you to believe that that there are ways to fine-tune this conception that you've made, and it doesn't work. I'm out of time. And again, these are things I've already mentioned before. So, borrowers in this environment where we follow inflation targeting to tell us the correct direction that the central bank should move interest rates. Now, they're not able to do it perfectly. I mean, again, what central banks do is what happens is often, and much of the time, what central banks want to happen. That is, especially, but they don't control interest rates completely. It's not a completely. But if they didn't meddle with it, it wouldn't move in that direction. Okay, that's it. Okay. I mentioned most of this. What happens when they burst? Well, again, in a way, it's a good thing. They need to. If you have overvalued assets, what do you think the direction of change of the prices should be? Up? No, it has to go down. And what do central banks hate above all things? Price deflation. Milton Friedman told them that that was something that you will cause and you must fear. But it's caused this sort of, especially now after we have no more money, we only have debt instruments called fiat currency. As liquidity flows out, we begin to see prices fall. The capital is released, and then we have recovery. And that's a good thing. If we don't have that, we're Japan. The Japanese tried to stop that from happening in 1989, and it took them 3 decades, but they were rich and they could afford it, to recover. So instead of, they reached a high plateau, but they just didn't leave that plateau. Whereas before 1989, they were growing at 6% average. And now they're growing at almost nothing. But they're rich. That's a good thing. So lower consumer prices brings consumers in, so all this happens, and it's a good thing. So that's it. Thank you very much. If you want these slides, I'll send them to you, or they have them. There's some bonuses here too, so in case I ran out of things to say. Thank you very much.